Ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, unwanted pets and relatives, greetings and salutations. It is I, your favorite obscure social studies teacher, whose undying love for liberty and his open-mindedness would definitely brand me a right-wing extremist, Mr. Palumbo, and this is the Professor Liberty Podcast. Thank you for tuning in, folks. I hope everyone is doing well out there on this first episode of 2025. You know, I appreciate all your support, the tens and tens of you faithful followers all across the fruited plain, and the 5 or 6 of you that are across the waters on the other continents of the world. Buckle up, folks. I have a banger of a show for you today, something that's been lurking deep in the crevasses of my brain like a raccoon trying to get into your trash at 3 a.m. Only this is more refined, more educational. Occasionally it's going to be funny, and it always has just enough expertise to make things interesting. But before all that, if you'd like to email the show, the email is professorliberty1776@gmail.com. That's professorliberty1776@gmail.com. Send me your thoughts, your feelings, your ideas, your disagreements, your allergy medications, whatever you want. You just got to send it to professorliberty1776@gmail.com. You can also hit me up on Facebook Messenger if you'd like to do that. Just remember, I'm one click away from a deep, meaningful conversation or just a funny meme. So today's show, we're going to start a new series. Don't worry, we're not going to stop the Important Battle series, but we're going to start a new series today called The Ancients. And we're going to begin The Ancients series with Rome. So today's episode is called The Ancients, the Romans. Now, when you look around the modern world, it is impossible to ignore the impact Rome has had. Our governments, much of the modern legal systems and concepts of things like citizenship are based on the Roman model. Architecture, if you've ever walked into a building with columns or seen arches, chances are you've seen Roman design. What about art? Well, they had the frescoes, which were paintings on walls, and graffiti, just like we have today. That was all Roman. They perfected the thing like the portraiture, which were realistic depictions of the human body, setting the stage for Western art in the Renaissance. And of course, the very alphabet we use today, the Latin-based alphabet, is derived from Roman script. But here is the big question we're going to answer today as we dive into Rome. How did a small village in Italy grow into one of the largest empires in history, spanning 3 continents and existing over 1,000 years? Was it luck or was it something more? And today we're going to try to answer that question. Now, every year when I begin this lesson on Rome, I always begin with Rome's geography. Now, if there was such a thing as being, quote, blessed by the geographic gods, unquote, Rome certainly qualifies. The location of the city itself we'd call strategic, not just for military advantage, but also for economic growth and expansion. Let's look at the Tiber River, which cuts through the center of Italy and provides access to the sea. The river itself was a natural highway for trade, transporting goods from the interior of the Italian peninsula into the Mediterranean. And as for early Rome, it also served as a defense mechanism. Any invading force would have to contend with the Tiber's challenging terrain, and the river was a great communication route to bring reinforcements or supplies. Second, Rome was situated on the 7 hills, a series of elevated landforms that provide excellent defense against potential invaders. From these hills, Rome could easily spot approaching armies, which made Rome nearly invulnerable to surprise attack. So geographically speaking, it's not hard to see why this location was so well suited for the growth of a powerful city-state. But it doesn't just end there. Rome was also close to the sea, giving it access to the Mediterranean. But it wasn't on the coast. It was just enough inland to avoid constant threats from pirates or naval invasion. This strategic positioning offered a perfect balance between access to resources and protection from potential threat. And let's zoom out a little bit and look at the Italian peninsula as a whole. Italy's location is in the heart of the Mediterranean, and it gives it access to 3 continents, Europe, Africa, and Asia, making it a perfect launching pad for expansion. This is why Italy's going to come up again in the Crusades. This is why Italy's going to come up again in the Renaissance, mostly because of where it lied geographically. Rome's geographical advantages allowed it to thrive, expand, and dominate the ancient Mediterranean world. Now let's take a look at Rome's founding myth, which tells us a lot about the values that shaped their identity. The myth of Romulus and Remus is one of the most iconic stories of all time. According to legend, Romulus and Remus were twin sons of Mars, the god of war. Abandoned as infants and left to die on the banks of the Tiber, they were rescued by a she-wolf who nursed them. Eventually, they were found by a shepherd and raised to become strong young men. As the twins grew, they decided to found a city near the site where they had been rescued. But of course, there was conflict. Romulus and Remus couldn't agree on where to build the city. And after an argument, Romulus killed Remus. Romulus went on to become the first king of this new city, which he named Rome after himself. While the myth is full of drama and emotion, it also speaks to some key aspects of Roman values. Things like survival, strength, leadership, and a sense of destiny. And while the myth itself is foundational to Roman identity, it also tells us something crucial about the Romans. They were not afraid to build something lasting out of the constant chaos of ancient life. The city of Rome was born in conflict, but that conflict could not destroy it. And this motif we're going to see repeated throughout Roman history. When faced with challenges, the Romans didn't back down. They adapted, they learned, and they grew. Their craftsmanship, too, reflects this resilience. The Romans didn't just build for the moment. They built for the future. And maybe this is why Rome earned the moniker the Eternal City, because Rome's uncanny ability to transform adversity into lasting achievements. Even today, you can still walk on Roman roads that carried soldiers and merchants. You can still drink from aqueducts that brought water for millennia. And you can sit in arenas that have witnessed the rise and fall of nations. Rome didn't just survive throughout the chaos, they turned it into a legacy. Now, while the myth of Romulus and Remus help us understand some of the foundational ideas of Rome, the Roman people, and Roman culture, the truth is Rome didn't just create itself out of thin air. The Romans were heavily influenced by their neighbors, particularly the Etruscans, the Greeks, and the Latins. The Etruscans were ancient people who lived in central Italy before the Romans came to power. And they provide many early cultural and political influences for the Romans. The Romans adopted the Etruscan religious practices, their alphabet, and much of their early political structure. In fact, the first kings of Rome were probably Etruscan. And the city's early architecture, including the use of the arch, was heavily influenced by Etruscan engineering. So let's talk about Greek influence. Many of you guys, if you follow history, know that the Greek gods, the Romans just kind of co-opted the Greek gods and turned them into the Roman gods. So, for example, Ares is the Greek god of war, and Mars is the Roman god of war. So, again, this shows Romans' ability to adapt. The Romans also adopted Greek philosophy, literature, and art. The Romans, famous for their pragmatism, took the things that they thought worked and made it their own, and they would often improve upon it. The Romans were innovators, not just copycats. They weren't interested in preserving everything. They focused on what was practical. And I like to make this point to the students in world history class, that pragmatism really manifested in three ways, and these three ways contributed to Rome's success. The first way that Romans were practical was through diplomacy. Rome's early success wasn't just about military conquest. It was about creating alliances and managing conquered peoples in a way that made them partners and not just subjects. Take, for example, the Latins. The Latins were people who lived around Rome in central Italy. When Rome expanded, rather than simply conquering the Latins, the Romans offered them citizenship. This gave these people legal rights, the ability to trade with Rome, and access to Roman courts. But they didn't have full Roman citizenship. Over time, the system expanded to include other conquered people, which helped create a sense of loyalty and shared identity among Rome's diverse subjects. This system worked remarkably well for Rome. It wasn't a form of colonial domination, it was a partnership. Many of the people who received citizenship chose to support Rome, knowing that they would be allowed to govern themselves while still being under Roman protection and benefiting from Roman resources. Rome was also incredibly shrewd when it came to playing rival factions off one another. During the Second Punic Wars, for instance, when Hannibal's army of Carthage was sweeping across Italy, Rome managed to maintain alliances with key Greek and Italian cities, isolating Carthage diplomatically. This diplomatic shrewdness and pragmatism, combined with Roman military power, kept Carthage from being able to unify other powers against Rome. The second way that Rome showed great pragmatism is in their military excellence. Of course, Rome's military prowess is legendary, but a key to the Romans' military success wasn't just about having the most soldiers or the largest empire. It was about practicality. Rome's military wasn't just powerful, it was efficient, and this efficiency was often what wins the wars. One of the great innovations of the Roman military was the development of the manipular legion. Prior to the manipular system, armies were organized into rigid lines, which made it difficult to adapt to changing circumstances on the battlefield. Rome's manipular legion, developed around the 4th century BC, divided soldiers into smaller, more flexible units. These units could act independently, maneuver, and adapt to various situations, and this flexibility made the Roman army especially efficient in different terrains and against different kinds of enemies. But the Romans didn't just rely on tactics and strategy. They were also logistical masters. The Roman army traveled long distances quickly and built roads, forts, and supply depots wherever they saw fit. This allowed the Romans to maintain an edge over their enemies, who often lacked the same mobility. And the third component to Roman success in their pragmatism was their practical approach to governing. Early Rome was a republic, and while the Romans are famous for their diplomatic principles, like the election of consuls and the Senate, Rome wasn't a democracy in the modern sense. It was a legal system of checks and balances designed to prevent any one individual from holding too much power. But what's fascinating is how the Romans adapt their system as they expanded. When crisis arose, the Romans didn't cling to their system at all costs. Instead, they were pragmatic, and they evolved their political structures to meet the needs of the moment. For example, during times of war, the Romans would appoint a dictator, a leader with absolute power. But this was only for a limited time to allow that dictator to take decisive actions in times of crisis. It's in this context, in 44 BC, when Julius Caesar declared dictator impertuo, or dictator for life, it was seen as a direct challenge to the established norms of Roman governance. The position of dictator had traditionally been temporary, usually lasting 6 months, like we said earlier, in times of crisis. But assuming the title of dictator for life, Caesar was not only placing himself above the usual checks and balances, but also signals his intention to rule indefinitely, consolidating all power to himself. This move was scandalous to many Romans, particularly among the Senate. To them, Caesar's assumption to absolute power was an affront to the very foundations of the Republic. The idea of one man wielding unchecked authority was seen as a threat to the freedom of Roman citizens and the balance of the Senate. This is why many senators, particularly those who feared Caesar's increasing dominance, viewed his assassination in March of 44 BC as a necessary and even patriotic act to restore the Republic. They believed killing Caesar would not only be a defense of their own political privileges, but it would also be an act of loyalty to Rome's ancient tradition. Now, we do have to mention here the reason that Caesar's assassination would spark a civil war is because though maybe the elites and the senators saw Caesar as a threat to the traditions of Rome, many of the common people saw Caesar as a messianic guy or a hero of the people. You got to remember that Caesar spent many years endearing himself to the common man and to the soldiers, and I guess you could say the working class of Rome. Well, after Caesar's death, showing that famous Roman pragmatism, Augustus Octavian will become the first real emperor of Rome, and he didn't simply just take over and abolish the old republican institutions. Instead, he cleverly presented himself as the restorer of the Republic, and he consolidated power under the guise of the traditional Roman structures. This allowed him to maintain the facade of Roman republicanism while wielding imperial power. So how did Rome succeed? Well, it wasn't one thing. As we've seen, geography plays a key part in any civilization. This is why I talk about it a lot in class. But we can definitely see the Roman pragmatism at work, and one of the key reasons why Rome was able to be so successful. Whether it be military matters or diplomacy or trade, the Romans showed themselves to be people of realistic expectations, strategic down-to-earth strategies. They were realists. And in many ways, they were utilitarian. They were people, whatever works. We don't care who invented it, but if it works, we can incorporate that into our own society and for our own benefit. Well, there you have it, folks. Rome's rise to power wasn't just a product of luck. It was carefully crafted, a combination of diplomacy, military might, and pragmatic governance. The ancient world, with all its complexities and intrigue, offers us a lesson of the Romans. Use what works. And in actuality, the founding fathers took many of the Roman principles of governance and they enshrined it into our document, the Constitution, a concept that would be known as federalism. Here at Professor Liberty, we seek to educate, inspire, and restore. If you like this podcast, please go to Apple Podcasts and give me a 5-star rating. You can even do my podcast a better if you give me a written review. Check out the website, ProfessorLiberty.com. You can sign up for the newsletter. You can get notified when new podcasts drop. And you can go to TeachersPayTeachers.com and get lessons, activities, worksheets for your homeschool or your classroom needs. Until next time, go throughout the land and proclaim liberty.